So then as the civilization evolves into its late megalopolitan phase, the values of money take over as the traditional state weakens, the aristocracy weakens, and then you get the grand civilization that is disconnected from the soil and is basically like a floating concrete island that's completely disconnected from nature and is purely urban. And then you begin to get the disintegration of the traditional estates, especially the estate of nobility. What happens to the priesthood as it evolves over time, on the other hand, is that with the rise of the philosopher, first with the scholastic philosopher, then later in the middle period with the great natural scientist philosopher, and then in the megalopolitan period with the intellect, the abstract intellectual, what you get is the gradual separation of learning from the priesthood, and learning gets more and more profane as time goes by until you get to the completely secularized intellectual who is fundamentally hostile to faith and regards anyone who follows faith or religion as basically unsophisticated in the megalopolitan phase. So we have this process of abstraction that happens to both these two estates as the civilization evolves. In the case of the nobility, law and politics get weaker and weaker as the values of money come into being, and money is basically an abstraction that divorces tradition from the countryside, weakens the state, and becomes the thing that is to be coveted. And in the case of the priesthood, with the rise of the philosopher and the disjunction of learning from the clerical world and its gradual secularization, you get the rise of the free-floating urban intellectual who pours nothing but scorn on the traditions of the countryside, the forest, the world of the early towns and the late cities. Now the only values are strictly megalopolitan. And so everything that had come before is now in the late phase brought into question. Then Spengler says that in each of the civilizations, the priesthood functions in a different way. Now if we look at, let's say, he says that the priesthood exemplifies space just as the nobility exemplifies time. So in a culture that negates space, like the classical civilization did, we would indeed expect to find a very weakened priesthood, which is what we do in fact find. In the Greek and Roman civilization, the priesthood never really took center stage and was always the weaker element by comparison with the nobility and the warrior class, which was always stronger in that civilization. But he says, of course, in the Faustian civilization, which is the civilization that puts this grand emphasis on space, you do indeed find a very strong priesthood and a very strong passionate conflict between nobility and priesthood, between empire and papacy that has characterized Faustian civilization. He says that the tension too in Egyptian civilization is also very strong between nobility and priesthood, since both space and time are strongly emphasized in the Egyptian civilization. He says that you can track this if you look at the back and forth oscillation in Egyptian civilization of the struggle for power over the state between the nobility and the priesthood. You can see this already in the Old Kingdom in the 4th dynasty, which is the great period of the floraison of the temples and so forth. The nobility is very strong in this period, but he says in the 5th dynasty, as the pyramids begin to shrink down and they become smaller and smaller, the great sun temples of the priesthood of Re become larger and larger, and this exemplifies the rising power of the priesthood over the nobility already in the 5th dynasty in Egypt. The struggle goes on until you get down all the way to the time of Akhenaten. Akhenaten himself is a great sort of priest-king in which you can see the struggle against both the priesthood and the nobility. In a certain sense, Akhenaten embodied both in his rejection of them and his attempt to hijack the state. I think the values are more priestly with Akhenaten than they are political, since the empire did indeed decline, and largely the chaos that follows his reign with the invasions of the Sea Peoples and the weakening of the empire in Palestine was the direct result of Akhenaten's carelessness and his basic insouciance toward maintaining an Egyptian empire. He just wasn't concerned with it, and so it fell apart, and due to his lack of statesman abilities, we owe it to him, the weakening of the empire. And then he says, and then in the later periods, once you get to the 21st dynasty and you get to the priest kings, the Theban priesthood actually for the first time hijacks the government, and you get these pharaohs who are actually Theban priests. This is Herihor is the first of these priests. This is about 1100 BC. They hijack the whole country. About a century or two later, by 900 BC, then we get the warrior priests from Libya that hijack the pharaoh, and then we get these Libyan warrior priests, or warrior, not priests, but warrior pharaohs who hijacked the whole operation. So we see this back and forth of the two castes in Egypt struggling to take possession of the civilization. In India, on the other hand, which has a very strong emphasis on space. Space is a kind of infinite space and infinite time, and the eternal cycles of eternal return. There's a very strong emphasis on the Brahmin priesthood, which almost is so highly emphasized in that civilization that it almost constitutes a second nobility, Spengler says. So the priesthood is almost stronger than the nobility in that civilization. And then he says that in the Magian civilization, of course, the priesthood and the nobility are combined so that the head ruler of the state is also the priest who is the head of the church. You can already see this with Julius Caesar assuming all the powers to himself. He becomes not only the first great statesman who is in charge of the entire empire, but he's also the Pontifex Maximus. He's the head of the actual Roman cults. And this is, of course, the ideal of the caliph. The caliph is both the high priest of the entire religion as well as the one who is in charge of the state form. So that becomes the relationship of nobility and priesthood in the Magian civilization. And so each one of the civilizations emphasizes this in a different way. Then he says that if we look at the intellectual world, we can see that the derivation of the intellectual world from the priesthood and the fact that the characteristic way that the intellectual world takes on is it takes on the local, regional, religious forms that are particular to that civilization. In classical civilization, for instance, we have the intellectual cult community that takes over the form language of the earlier Orphic cults led by a priest king, who are now led by a great philosopher like Plato or Aristotle. And we have these cult communities, the Academy, the Stoa, the Peripatetics, the Pythagorean Brotherhood. We have these sort of intellectual cult communities there, which show the derivation. Then he says in Magian civilization, it is from Magian civilization that we owe the idea of the canon, the sacred book. The whole idea of the book and having a sacred canon of texts comes from the Magian civilization, and that's the relationship of the intellectual to its sacerdotal function in that civilization. And then in the Faustian civilization, he says there's a very Catholic aspect to the intellectual, the way that the intellect is unfolded in the West, with the creation of sects, by the Kantians and the Hegelians. We have these different sects. We have heretics like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. We have great renouncers and individuals who are philosophers connected to communities and sects, but who also are lone philosophers and so forth. So the basic structures and forms of the Catholic Church carry on into Faustian civilization's whole intellectual form language. And then he ends the book by saying that ends this chapter by saying that what happens in the civilization phase is that the two estates begin to get weakened. They've been weakened all along now with a secularized priesthood on the one hand and money hijacking the traditional values of the nobility on the other, so that the priesthood is now free to criticize, and the nobility is now free to make money with no checks on either one now. And at the end, these two disintegrate, and then the third estate has already arisen in the meantime, the bourgeois, the middle class. Then this lays the groundwork for the coming of the fourth estate, the masses, which are basically formless, the proletariat, the plebeian world, which slowly then begins to hijack and infiltrate the political machinery, as we'll see in the next chapter on the state. So that's the upshot of this wonderful chapter on the two estates, nobility and priesthood. The next chapter is chapter 11 on the state and history.